Today I'm here to talk about science fiction fantasy books I've been reading recently, and when I went to go and look at all the books I was going to talk about in this video here, I realized that I have a lot of unpopular opinions, so it's twofold. First, there are books that are really popular online, specifically on BookTube, that I don't particularly like apparently, and there's also some really underhyped or less beloved books that I personally like, but you all might end up hating. So I'm nervous to make this recommendation video and review video here today, but if that all sounds good, let's get started anyway. First, let's start with science fiction, starting with Souls in the Great Machine by McMullen. And this is a really chunky science fiction book that I'll do my best to summarize, but forgive me for not having always the correct words to put this into context. But essentially, this is set in a post-apocalyptic, almost dystopian-like future. There has been horrific disasters in our future, and now humanity is trying to recover. We have lost a lot of our technology. However, we've found ways to bring technology back. However, in doing so, in creating these machines again, it requires sacrifices, or rather those to be enslaved within the machine, hence the title of this book. Now, this is a premise that I thought was incredibly fascinating. I love how dark and sinister it is by nature. It definitely gave me slight vibes, or was reminiscent of something like The Matrix, but obviously if you're making that comparison too closely, I think you'll be left disappointed, because this book and this series appears to be quite different in what it's trying to do. But we follow this very broken society as they are struggling to move forward, and again, you have those that are enslaved in this dark future. So it's not a happy book. I've looked at some of the book reviews that are already out there, and a lot of people are very critical of this outlook on humanity, especially the female representation in this book is not amazing. It's basically a book that really shows women being put as second place citizens. It does no favors. There is no great, at least so far that I've read, because it's technically the first book and I believe what is a trilogy, but at least at this point, this book series does not uplift women or show women breaking the chains. Instead, it really shows a regression of society, which perhaps is very hard for a lot of people to read, and not something that I'm looking to read necessarily. And this book definitely does have a male gaze, which again is not one of the reasons I like this book. I like this book despite those reasons. And I gotta say, I was really enamored by this one. Again, it's a really unique concept of a story. It's very epic in nature. Again, it's very long and drawn out, and a lot of the story deals with the inner workings of the society, the interplay between the characters. The characters are not unlikable. Again, everyone's kind of doing dark and despicable things, and you see people getting stepped on in order for someone to move up in society. I was fascinated by it, but this is a book that is hard for me to recommend to all of you, because while I really liked it, it was a 4-star read for me, and I definitely can't stop thinking about it. I also am aware of the fact that there's a lot of negative reviews around this book, and I do recognize them. Again, I've kind of pointed out some of them along the way, but I do recognize that while I love this book, you may not like it. In fact, a lot of you may hate this book, and I always hate to make those broad recommendations only to have people come back to my videos and say, what is wrong with you? This book is terrible. It's junk. I can't believe you recommended this. So I just want to acknowledge that I recognize that I have very niche taste when it comes to science fiction. I like things that are out of the box. I certainly like dark books. While this is definitely not horror by any means, it leans into that dark dystopian post-apocalyptic world that has a grim tone to it, which is very appealing to me as someone who loves kind of grim science fiction and fantasy and horror and all of that. And so this book worked well for me. I see its flaws. I don't think it's perfect, but I'm really intrigued by it. If I can get my hands on the later books, I will definitely be continuing on. If you share my taste in these interesting yet very depressing worlds, this is one you may want to pick up. If some of the things I mentioned do not appeal to you, you may want to skip this one and save yourself the trouble. Next, continuing one of my personal goals to read all the good books this year, I decided to pick up not one, but 2 books by one of my favorite authors. And so the first book I read was Diamond Age by Neal Stephenson, who again is an author I adore. This is one of their earlier backlist books, and one I've been meaning to get to for honestly over a year now, so I finally got it done. This is a post-cyberpunk story. I made the mistake in a past video calling it cyberpunk, and lots of people let me know in the comments that is not correct. It is set in a world, a dystopian world, that is after more the cyberpunk genre, more of a response or continuation of what would come perhaps afterwards. And I think it's a very interesting concept. Within the story, there are some interesting ideas. It's almost a coming-of-age story around this young woman. However, I'm shocked to say that not only did I not love this book, I didn't like this book. I have to check my Goodreads review, but I believe I gave it 2 stars, which is rough by my rating standard. And so I don't have a lot of good things to say about this book. I know other people are probably yelling at their screens as they watch this. Please let me know what part of the book appealed to you, because for me, this book just did not work on many levels. I didn't find the story engaging or interesting. The main character, the world building just was not what I expected from Neal Stephenson, and perhaps that's a lot of my criticisms. Again, I think it's not their first work, but one of their earlier ones. And for me, this book lacked the parts of Neal Stephenson's work that I personally adore. He always brings in interesting scientific ideas and theories and concepts. And while I could see threads of it there in the story, it felt oh so bare and not satisfying. Perhaps if I picked up this book not knowing who the author was, perhaps I would have been kinder to this book. But knowing Neal Stephenson and expecting certain things from him as an author, this one left me very depressed and disappointed. I thought it was weak, and I easily could have put this book down, but I felt because he's such a beloved author, it was important for me to go through his backlist, so I did finish it. But I don't have too much more to say about it because it was a very weak read, didn't leave much of an impression on me, and that is so again disappointing from an author that I should have loved. And apparently I just wanted to turn things around, so rather than reading another author, I went back to Neal Stephenson again, this time reading Termination Shock, which I believe is their newest release. It came out a couple years ago. And this is an eco-thriller that is set in a near future as we see the decay or decline of our environment and seeing the climate cost of what is happening today. And this is a book that I was really excited to get into because I really loved other eco-thrillers, so things like The Deluge or The Swarm have all really appealed to me and been 5-star favorites over the last couple years. This one I went to a little bit cautiously, obviously off the tails of Diamond Age that had a bit subdued my roaring love for Neal Stephenson. And I also knew that this one, among people who love Stephenson, don't consider Termination Shock to be one of his absolute best. And I will echo that. So this one is good. I think it is generally representative of his work. There were some moments that I found very interesting to read about. For instance, I remember there was a part talking about different viruses that I actually stopped the book and had to tell my husband the fun facts that I learned. And a lot of other authors don't compel me to actually stop my book and share it with him because he's not always that interested. But I love that with Neal Stephenson, that he just brings in really interesting ideas that for me turn into really good conversation over a dinner party. Again, I have probably different dinner parties than a lot of you do. But as other reviewers have said, I'm going to echo and just say that it's not his worst book, but I also don't think it's his best. It's one of his most middly books, which is a useless descriptor here. But essentially, it's not the place I'd recommend starting with this author's work. But if you love them like I do think it's worth going through their backlist, and this is one that I wouldn't skip. I just wouldn't start here. Next, let's talk about This Alien Shore by C.S. Friedman. This is a book that I did as a buddy read with Whitney from Secret to Storycraft, who sent me a copy of this audiobook. And thankfully, this is one I really enjoyed. I don't think this one's an unpopular opinion because those of you that talked to me about this book said you also enjoyed this one. So this book, to give a really vague, simple synopsis, follows a woman who is in this future, and she has to essentially go on the run and find out more about her past and history, and gets pulled into a larger global or more wider spread conflict, and the story goes from there. This is one that, while it is science fiction, has threads of a thriller. It really read to me like more of a thriller narrative where you have a lot of suspense. There are characters and you don't always know their backstory, and kind of slowly figuring things out along the way. There's a little bit of side romance, which I didn't need, but kind of fit the story and the tone of it very well. This book just felt very escapist. It reminded me of the books that I read perhaps back in the 90s, and I think really in a good way ages the story for those that kind of want those more nostalgic feels, which I definitely got, even though I've never read this book before or this author. But for me, it was just an engaging story with a young woman on the run and trying to figure things out and trying to figure out who were her allies and what was going on in her mind. It's one that I went into incredibly blind, which is why I'm keeping the synopsis so vague, is I do think that it's fun to kind of piece it together along the way. I really enjoyed, as I mentioned, the suspense of the story. I worried for the character. I wanted to know what was all going on and found it very satisfying as it slowly got revealed. I don't want to oversell this book in terms of the complexity or uniqueness of it. I do think it leans into a lot of tropes, but it did so in a way, again, that was more comforting rather than feeling tired. I found it to be engaging. I flew through it. It was a book that I wanted to be reading it at every moment. I found myself looking for opportunities to pick up the book because I wanted to know what was going to happen next, and I always take that as a good sign. So I definitely want to read more by this author. I think they've also done some other more fantasy stories, so I'll pick up those when I get a chance. So I would recommend this book, although I don't think it's is the most conceptually interesting book if you're someone who comes for the hard science fiction. The world building was interesting to an extent, but again, it's a little bit more simplified and definitely leans perhaps into more of a sci-fantasy feel at times, where you don't always get the hard science behind everything that's going on, or there isn't necessarily the hard science to back up the story, but instead just science kind of happens to the story to make it move along. Regardless, if you go in with the right expectations, if you're not looking for a Neal Stephenson read-alike, a good one, I do recommend this book. I think it is enjoyable, it's fun and fast-paced, and it's easy for someone looking for, again, a sci-fi thriller that in my mind really fit the bill. Next, let's talk about The Gone World, which is a sci-fi thriller that involves agents and murder and investigations. This is one I picked up not knowing too much about it. I picked it up as part of my patron book club, essentially once a quarter. My top tier patrons are able to nominate a book for my TBR, so this is the one I agreed to read over the winter months as part of the poll. And so this is one that I've heard amazing things about. So many people who read it love it. It seems to be one of those books that perhaps is not the most hyped online. It's not always the most well-known book, but of the people I know who have read it, they all adore it. It's a 5-star read, it's a favorite. They cannot stop thinking about it, they cannot stop talking about it. And so I was eager to check it out, hoping again to have that same favorite experience. The book starts out as a more traditional mystery story, and I'll be honest, had I not known it had a speculative or science fiction element to it, I easily could have put the book down. While I enjoy mysteries, I used to read a lot more of them when I was a kid, and this one seemed fine, but very average, but again, I kept reading. My issue with this book essentially though is the fact that had I not had some sort of obligation to read it as part of my patron agreements, as well as the fact that I knew there was something coming and was kind of promised to keep reading, I easily could have put this book down because again, it read to be very average and it took a really long time for that twist to come in. Now for some readers, I know that that twist really reframes the whole story and made it so exciting. For me, I was already very tired of this book by the time I got there, and so for me, because I found the characters to be average, the story up until that point to be average, while I found the twist and the speculative element to be neat and cool, it wasn't enough to really redeem the story. I'm someone, I always say, who enjoys the journey, or in this case, doesn't enjoy the journey. And so a really cool climax, and ending, and all of that does not save a book that takes that long to appeal to me. And this book just felt very average for having such a cool and supposedly creative idea behind it. It just felt very simple, and I didn't see what other people adore so much in this book. So I'm sorry, again, I had a patron recommend this book to me. I know they love this book. I wish I love it more, but it's still a fun experiment to get other people recommending me books to get different things on my TBR, because sometimes they're a winner. Unfortunately, this one was not. Now let's switch over to fantasy, talking about Mislaid in Parts Half Unknown by Seanan McGuire. This is the latest book in the Wayward Children series, which is long running. In this latest book, we are introduced to another child who comes back through a portal, and they appear to have the ability to find lost things. And so because of this, the other children are interested in using their abilities to perhaps find the lost doors, because again, a lot of these children want to go back to the fancy worlds that they left and have never really given up hope of returning back to what they believe to be their homes. In terms of premise, I thought that was really interesting as a setup. I'm actually surprised it took this many books before something like that was explored. My favorite aspect of the story actually ended up being the dinosaurs and the prehistoric bits, and I just wish it had been a larger part of the story. Again, they're only novellas, so they're very quick. And I will admit that while I like the premise of this one, I like the dinosaurs, the rest of the story felt fine, but not the most original. I do find it hard with these long-running episodic series to make each entry interesting. Obviously, I loved last year's entry quite a bit, but I do find the series, for me at least, a little bit hit or miss, a little bit uneven in quality. Sometimes the author comes up with something that I find really interesting to explore, and while the premise sounded good, the actual execution sounded fine. It just kind of reminded me of a children's story where you have the children going around and doing a thing and hanging out with dinosaurs for a little bit, and just felt a bit too simplistic. I do hope that the author finds something new to do with the next entry if the series is going to be continuing past here, because I just feel like it's a really interesting concept that might be getting a little bit tired. Now, going back to more unpopular opinions, let's talk about Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. It's the first book in a trilogy that is a booktube darling. This is perhaps one of the most beloved, supposedly underhyped booktube series that is called Underhyped, but everyone I know is talking about it and loving it, and so I had to pick it up. The first book starts out with this city that used to be glittering and gold and wonderful and is now in decline, and then we follow characters that are looking to save this city. I knew very little of the plot going into it and just went to it again based off of all these gushing reviews. Now, I want to preface this book review by saying that this series, or at least this first book, because I haven't gone past the first book, is fine. I do consider it to be an average good fantasy series, so the characters are fine, the world is fine, the story is fine, but I gave this book 3 stars, and personally I don't feel like it deserves a higher rating than that based off of what I've read. The writing felt very juvenile and simplistic, the characters likewise felt very flat and not very multi-dimensional, and in terms of the story, again, it felt like a trope or a setup that I felt like I've read before, and it just didn't feel particularly innovative. I have this perhaps unpopular opinion, and I don't mean to directly criticize any other book reviewer, but it seems as if with this series, it became so beloved simply because, again, it was more underhyped, it appeared to be a hidden gem, and I do understand the appeal as a reviewer. I do it too, that when I find something that I like that is not well known on the internet, I enjoy shouting about it online. Even if it's not a perfect series or a perfect book, it's fun to bring something new because, again, everyone's heard of Brandon Sanderson and Joe Abercrombie, and so if you find an author that appears new and you feel like you're bringing a new recommendation to the booktube table, I think it's really exciting. And that's what I think or feel like happened here, where this book series is fine, it's pretty good, but is it the best series ever? Is it an all-time favorite of mine? Absolutely not. I feel like this book series has become overhyped simply because of the fact that it is such a hidden gem, and I just don't think that the gem that is found here is quite as amazing as everyone else makes it out to be. Man, I've got hot takes today. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? Let me know what is one of your unpopular opinions about a really popular book online, or tell me about a book that you feel like is underhyped or not loved online that you think is actually a lot better than everyone else thinks it is. So if you have a hot take, drop it in the comments and maybe we can turn this into a follow-up video. If you enjoyed this video, if you want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. If you want to drop a comment, even just a little emoji, like a flame for a hot take, that would be great. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.